Hello, it's Brad Laurie or BlockchainBrad, and on behalf of BlockVera, an exclusive, something very unique today, and that is speaking with Erik Voorhees. He needs no introduction. He is well known right throughout blockchain and crypto space, and obviously for many good reasons as well. A proponent of Bitcoin, built his own system, product, service known as Shapeshift, and a lot more coming. Erik, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. Now, mate, just in that pre-discussion before we clicked the start button, obviously there's a lot that you've done, a lot that you've achieved. But Erik, what are some of the things that you think are the most important when it comes to cryptography, when it comes to transparent accounts, utilizing the blockchain? Why are these things so important when we talk about changing the financial paradigm?
Yeah, so the question is why is Bitcoin so important to changing the financial paradigm?
Well, we can start with Bitcoin if you want, because I was trying to open it up a bit more, but we can.
So I often will use Bitcoin to sort of refer to all of these crypto technologies. So we'll just use the term crypto. Why is crypto important to changing finance? The reason is to open it up so that anyone in the world can access financial services without someone censoring them, so that anyone can move money anywhere in the world instantly. And it should flow as freely as information flows, because money ultimately is information. So we currently live in this world where banks and governments control how money works, and they do not innovate. They censor people, and all sorts of inefficiencies exist in that system. Crypto allows people to break out of that system without asking anyone's permission to do so. So that's why it's important.
And Erik, in the pre-discussion, I mentioned to you as well, one of the reasons I got into this was because of you. And that is because of that view you had of the vision of sound money, that vision, that libertarian ideal as well. So can you comment a bit more on that ideal that you started with? And do you uphold some of those values still, despite that it's now, there's different camps as Bitcoin's, evolved?
Yeah, so money is really the most important good in the entire economy. And people don't think of money as a good. They think of everything other than money being the good. But money is half of every transaction in the world. It is the most important thing that people exchange value for. You're either exchanging your labor for money, or you're exchanging some other good for money. Money's incredibly, incredibly important. Most people believe in market economies to some degree, and yet we live in a world where the most important good is centrally controlled. That is antithetical to a market economy. So I think if for anyone who actually believes in markets, they have to desire a decentralized sound money that doesn't have any central party controlling it. And Bitcoin was really the first technology that allowed that. I mean, gold allowed that, but gold is not very useful for modern commerce. The only way you can use gold for modern commerce is if you warehouse it and then issue, digital receipts or digital bearer bonds for that gold. And that can be efficient, but then you still have to trust the custodian of that gold. The custodian can get shut down by the government if they want to censor the payments. So really the only way you can have sound money that doesn't get censored is with Bitcoin and other crypto technology.
Right, and it obviously opened up that very exciting social network, that social potential, and even the belief in the potential for sound money, which is something that really hadn't been evidenced before empirically or through code itself. Now, what about today though? We see that there's an emergence of all kinds of classifications, all kinds of digital assets as they're known, from cryptocurrencies and trying to drive for sound money, those that are utilities potentially, and those that are commodities. What are your thoughts on these efforts to try and expand what Bitcoin started?
Yeah, I think it's great. I think part of Bitcoin's decentralization is that there are all these different blockchains getting built up, some which compete directly with Bitcoin, some which are doing very different things. And it's really this branching technology that is kind of creeping into all areas of finance and beyond. So I like to tell people that essentially what's happening is that the entire financial industry is transitioning from a analog bordered structure to a decentralized digital structure. And so all of the financial services that currently exist are getting reimagined on blockchains. And then there will be a bunch of new services that couldn't have existed prior to blockchains that also get created. In the same way that Twitter was not a It was not just a digital version of something that came before Twitter. It was something brand new that was only able to be created because of the internet. There will be new financial systems that are created only because they work on blockchains that couldn't have existed before.
Right.
I think it's fantastic that there is the diversity of different interests in this ecosystem.
I see. And Eric, you mentioned it before also about this imperative of trying to educate ourselves about money, to really understand just how centralized, traditional and old money has been for many of the economies around the world. Why do you think there's such a dearth, even at the educational level itself, of understanding the dynamics of money, the way in which money works, so that we obviously have a reason to make the switch?
I think the dearth comes from the fact that most people are stuck in a public education system. So when government manages education and government manages money, there's a very strong incentive for government to not teach about the problems of its money system. That shouldn't really be a surprise to anyone. So that's, I think, the fundamental issue. Most people grow up through high school and college and never really understand much about finance or money at all. Something like 40% of Americans think that the dollar is still backed by gold, which is just atrocious. And it's crazy to have that level of ignorance about something which is important to everyone. Everyone spends their lives chasing and gathering and spending money, and to have that all those people not really understand how it works, how even banking works at a simple level, is pretty bad.
Mm. Yeah, I would tend to agree. And likewise for Australia and many other parts of the world. And it's ironic, given that some of these countries purport to have some of the best education systems in the world, and yet we don't invest in more understanding, for our youth in how money actually does work. Now, Eric, I want to move it back to Bitcoin because, again, in that pre-discussion, and I mentioned that I really want to dig deep. You asked one of the key evangelists of Bitcoin, and also just more generally in the innovation that blockchain offers. So, what are some of those key drivers of value for Bitcoin itself?
Well, the main value of Bitcoin is that you can use it to move value anywhere in the world instantly at near zero cost, and no one can stop you. That's the fundamental utility that Bitcoin offers, is that ability to move value anywhere without anyone being able to stop you. Um, Now, over the years, Bitcoin has gained some other attributes that continue to reinforce its value. So the fact that it's the longest running blockchain makes it more valuable because it's been around the longest. It's obviously the safest and the most tested of all the blockchains because it's been around the longest. So it is gaining some other attributes that it didn't have, in its early years, and it's also a lot more stable than a lot of the other assets because it's a larger market. So over time, it becomes more stable, more liquid, more trusted. The brand is just out there more. Uh, most people now in the modern world have heard of Bitcoin. That was definitely not the case 8 years ago. So for all these reasons, it's gaining value, but those are sort of ancillary to the core value proposition, which is just the ability to move money anywhere in the world instantly.
Right, and obviously there's a lot of different other aspects too. Perhaps we don't have time to mention every single one today. But with regard to your own journey, obviously, many people know that you started very early in your own Bitcoin journey. Can you just touch on that as well? Because you are one of the most vocal libertarians in the space. You genuinely stand by the value of decentralized money and also what it can do for the majority of people in the world, who particularly the unbanked. So do you still stand by those? And what's your own experience been from the beginning?
Yeah, well, I learned about it in May of 2011 and totally fell down the rabbit hole. Prior to that, I had been really dismayed to see how centrally controlled money was in the world, and that we lived in this faux market where people thought we had a capitalist system, but actually it's just controlled by central banks at its core, which is the money. But I didn't know what the solution to that was until I learned about Bitcoin, and that was the first thing that was actually a plausible alternative to that world. So that's what got me so excited about it. I think it's great that Bitcoin attracts people that aren't like me, because frankly, people that think like me are a tiny portion of the population. Most people love governments and want more government every year after year, and that's unfortunate. But Bitcoin helps those people too. I mean, it helps
Mm.
anyone who uses money, which is the entire world, and it doesn't really matter what their ideologies are.
Right. And, for those who, like me, who've come from a different angle from education and teaching, it's the same thing as well, in that we also are looking for alternative solutions to some of the core problems we see globally. We're seeing more macro issues emerge because of these serious centralized issues. But let's talk more about the specifics also of the tech of Bitcoin, because, obviously things haven't evolved, and we do see the emergence of specific camps wanting certain things from Bitcoin. So, what are your thoughts on that as we see some move into a very hardcore, very tribal, hodl view, as opposed to even acknowledging the potential of it becoming a payment system?
Yeah, well, certainly in the early days, everyone that was into Bitcoin felt like they were on the same team and in it for the same reason and saw Bitcoin as the same thing. And as it grew and expanded, the number of people that got involved got larger, the diversity in views got larger. And I think Bitcoin can't do everything for every person. It has a
Mm,
number of design trade-offs in its engineering that make it really good in some ways and poor in other ways, and that's okay. The people that need other services from crypto technology can build other blockchains that are optimized in different ways. So I think that's good. Again, that's part of the decentralization. So we have a world where people can have multiple blockchains, multiple assets for different things, and we don't need to have some sort of monolithic structure that is perfect for everyone for every opportunity. That's not realistic.
and that's a really good point. The question will be, and you've even alluded to this sometimes, is that the tech needs to marry with the intention or the camp as such. So in this respect, this is the deep dive now. Do you think that the technology itself is meeting the needs, for example, today as that sound money? Because one of the things I've heard you say before in other interviews, and I do agree with this statement, is that, it's prospective sound money in that it's evolving to become that. But, we're still in that transition towards that goal. So in that respect, are you concerned by those who say that it's sound money today?
Um, I mean, sound money is like it's a destination. It's something that you can never fully achieve.
Hmm.
It's always shades of gray. It's like decentralization. Nothing can be perfectly decentralized, but things are relatively more or less decentralized than each other. So Bitcoin obviously has many, if not all, of the attributes that sound money needs to have. And as it gets highly liquid, it becomes practical in addition to all those attributes. So certainly, Bitcoin today is much better money than Bitcoin was, you know, 8 years ago. It's far more
Mm.
usable. It's far more liquid. Someone who wants to, use $10 million of it for something can do that now, whereas there was zero liquidity for that 8 years ago. So yeah, I think it's continuing to improve. The software gets better and better. There are very slowly features that get added to the protocol, some of which have been really important, and so it's slowly improving over time. It's becoming increasingly stable and trusted. So yeah, I think that's great.
Right, so slow improvements, and as you mentioned, is evidence right now on the blockchain of those large transactions. There's even specific exchanges emerging for the institutional money, to experiment with Bitcoin itself as an asset. But what about fiat? One of the things that you taught me in one of your interviews was that fiat is money by decree. So, what are your thoughts on fiat itself, so that people can better understand how we're trying to move away from fiat?
Yeah, fiat. So I love that fiat is now in the popular consciousness as the term. It gets used on Bloomberg and CNBC now, whereas before Bitcoin, the word fiat was never used.
It's true.
Um, Fiat, essentially what fiat means is value by decree. So the dollar or the euro or the yen, these are all fiat currencies because their value is due to the decree of a government. That's why they have value.
Mhm.
Gold is not fiat. Its value comes from an open market and the trading of gold. No one decrees that gold has value. Similarly, Bitcoin is not fiat because no one decrees that Bitcoin has value. It's just an open market for that asset. So first, it's important to understand that fiat currencies are um, they have their value not because a market migrated into them, but because they are essentially put upon the market by a coercive force, by a government in all cases. Um, the reason this is important is that fiat is a massive scam, and I don't use that word lightly. I use it as fiat is the worst scam ever perpetrated on mankind. And the scam is as follows: a government takes control of money issues a fiat currency, and everyone in the economy needs to use that as their form of money. The government has the ability to print it, and it does this through its central banks. So the government prints money whenever it wishes and spends it on things. Generally, it spends it on the things that get politicians elected, or even more insidious, it spends it on things that directly benefit certain people that are close to the government. But it prints money and spends that money. As that money is circulating around the economy, general price levels rise. This is inflation because the money supply is inflated, thus prices rise due to that. So what you get is people that don't get to print the money end up with higher prices before that money is circulated around. And people with the money printer get to benefit from printing money and buying real goods with that printed money. And as long as the inflation rate is held low enough, the scam perpetuates because people don't really notice that they're losing 2, 3, 4% of their value every year in assets. Their bank account doesn't deduct. It's not like they have $100 and then next year they have $98. It's still 100, so they don't realize that the $100 can't buy as much as it did. And the scam just continues year after year. And so everyone holding government money is losing a little bit of value each year. And this equates to hundreds of billions of dollars a year being stolen from people by those who are printing money. It's horrible. I think when the world gets past this phase, it'll look back at fiat currency as a crazy machination of very unethical people, frankly. It'll be looked at very poorly by generations in front of us. And thankfully, we have an alternative. People who want to avoid it, obviously, can move into things like gold, but Bitcoin is far more practical for actual commerce. So now you can escape inflation by just not holding fiat anymore, and that's a beautiful thing.
Right, and as you know as well, the fiat is attached to nation states, and their own ideologies, their own agenda. So once again, you don't have that borderless sort of opening for a new financial system that is, truly and authentically global, and that also perpetuates more of these currency wars we see currently, and the things that underpin them. So in that sense, also money does have other agents at play, and it certainly causes a lot of other civil unrest and political unrest. So do you think that this kind of transition into a new paradigm, one that is authentically decentralized, can actually also benefit us in a political sense, in a more authentically globalized and social network of people?
Yeah, I generally think that the average politician makes the world worse. And so if you remove power from politicians, you'll generally have a better world. Not a perfect world, but a better one. And money is one of the strongest tools that governments have available to them. By being able to print money, it allows them to spend far past what they can tax and borrow, and to do all sorts of horrible things with that money. So yeah, I think a world with sound money would be a world where government is necessarily smaller because it can't fund itself through currency debasement. And a world where government is necessarily smaller is a world which would be better. I think it would allow people to flourish more greatly. It would decentralize power. It would reduce corruption in the same way that centralizing power increases corruption.
Well said. Now, the interesting part will be, Erik, how we move forward in concert with these existing governments, because they're not going away. So moving from an ideal to the real in terms of how these kinds of new digital assets can actually work and synchronize with some of these current models. And that's why, these conversations about Bitcoin need to be had. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about in that context is ultra-libertarianism, or hyper-libertarianism, in the sense that we see some Roger Ver is a really good example of this, where he is just so adamant that you want to circumvent that authority, really push for moving away from any semblance of association or synchronization with these centralized entities. Do you feel the same way in this sense? Because obviously there's inherent risks in that ultra libertarian view when it comes to uptake and adoption of something like Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of things I disagree with Roger on, but on this point, I'm in the same camp. I'm morally opposed to coercion. Basically governments get their authority from coercion. I think that's an unethical basis for society to be built on, and the less of it, the more ethical the society. So yeah, I don't think governments are going away anytime soon, unfortunately. But I would like to just see them continue to shrink as much as possible. And if they can get to zero and society works well at that point, then that would be great. That would be ideal.
So what are your thoughts on the services of societies? In Australia, for example, we have a very comprehensive and complex tax system, but we also pay a lot of tax for the goods and services that we enjoy. So how do you work around those kind of issues when it comes to, proponent, when you want to espouse the idea of a non-government scenario, but yet reap the benefits of, a civil society?
Yeah. I mean, basically, if there's a good or service that people want, it is better handled in a competitive market than by a monopoly provider. So all a government is a coercive monopoly provider, and it's very strange that a lot of people, almost everyone, is opposed to monopoly. Like they get that it's bad to have monopolies, and yet they endorse the government, which is the strongest and most powerful of all monopolies. And they don't seem to realize that that's a complete contradiction.
Mm,
So there's nothing magical about governments. It's just an organization of people that use force on other people. And I don't, I think whenever you do that, um, you cause you cause harm. I mean,
mm,
you basically, a government steals from people by force in order to provide goods and services to some other people. So if you build a society based on stealing from one group and giving it to another, you shouldn't be surprised if there are problems and if you start to get, antagonism between different groups of people, because it's a world in which people can steal from each other. And in the
mm,
same way that you wouldn't feel it's okay to walk into your neighbor's house and steal their stuff, it's not okay to steal someone's stuff who's in a different part of the country from you, and it's not okay to get a bunch of your buddies together and go steal from a minority group that doesn't have as many buddies. And in
mm.
that way, democracy is really just voting in the largest gang to steal from minorities who didn't have the vote. Um, I think it's maybe a better system than what used to exist in the past, but I also think humanity can do a lot better through markets. And markets aren't perfect; they cause problems. They don't solve all other problems, but I think markets tend to iterate and improve with time, whereas governments tend to decay and corrupt and centralize with time.
Right. And obviously, there's a veil of verisimilitudes as well, because we see a lot of promises for the people. But you're making the point that a lot of these parties don't act for the people, but more for themselves and their interests. And we see that emerge with things
Well,
like crony capitalism as well.
yeah, I'm not even saying that they don't act for the people. Which people are they acting for, right? So
Right.
people are different. There are billions of people in the world. They all have their own desires and their own beliefs and their own feelings.
Mm,
And so any politician that says they're acting for the people, you should ask, well, okay, whom? Which
mm,
group of the people are you acting for? And even if you're acting for a majority, that doesn't mean it's okay to harm a minority just to help a majority, which is essentially the basics of democracy.
mm.
And most people seem to be okay with that, but I'm not. And I also realize I'm in the minority of people that thinks that way.
I see. And what's interesting also, Eric, especially in the US, for example, at the moment, there's a lot of discussion about the emergence of increasing wealth disparity, ever increasing at the moment because of this issue we're talking about right now, this veil that of capitalism. But really, in the guise of capitalism, there's a lot more at play here, and people perhaps don't understand ramifications of just simply adopting the status quo, following through on, what their promises are. As you said, it behooves us to dig deeper.
Yeah, yeah. And when people talk about wealth disparity, I don't really care about wealth disparity. I care that people are left alone and not harmed. I think a world in which everyone's getting richer is great, but just through math and through compounding numbers, you'll end up getting people that get increasingly wealthy, and people that are not as wealthy as those people. And the gaps will obviously grow even when everyone's getting wealthier. I think
Mm,
it's much more important that everyone is getting wealthier rather than having something that is stagnant but equal, or decaying but equal.
mm. And do you think it's fair to say, though, if you mentioned you don't care about wealth disparity, but if it gets to such an extent where it is causing harm, quite literally, in the functioning of people, for their own basic needs, does that become an issue then?
Well, in that case, it's not, the issue isn't the disparity in wealth. The issue is poverty. When people can't support themselves, that's an issue of poverty, not of wealth disparity. So there are places in the world where wealth disparity is very low and everyone's very poor. I would say that's worse than a place in which there is very high wealth disparity, but people in general are wealthy. So it's not the difference between people that matters. I think it's, are there people who are suffering because of the poverty that they exist in, and if so, we should try to help those people. And I don't care how many billionaires or trillionaires there are. That's great, as long as they're earning that money through voluntary, non-coercive means. If there are people that need help, then we should help them.
Right. So you really are a proponent of that free market, and that's obviously why you know and you support Bitcoin so much. Let's talk about some of the tech for a moment. Now, one of the things that you have made clear, and also you cleared up this misnomer, is that Bitcoin is inflationary by design, despite the disinflationary trajectory of the model. So can you touch on that a bit more to educate those who think it's deflationary?
Yeah. So this term inflation has gotten kind of misused. The original meaning of inflation is when the supply of money increases, and inflation in the supply of money. Generally, when that happens, prices rise. And there are things that can cause prices to not rise. There are other variables, but all things equal, if you increase the supply of money, prices will tend to rise. And deflation is the opposite, is not the falling of price, but it is the falling in the supply of money. So with that definition, Bitcoin is inflationary. There are more and more Bitcoins created every day.
Mm-hmm.
That rate of inflation falls over time towards zero. So 10 years from now, Bitcoin will be less inflationary than it is today. And today, Bitcoin is less inflationary than it was 8 years ago. But it is always inflationary.
Mm-hmm.
The reason people get confused is that because the supply of Bitcoin does not grow as fast as demand for it, prices of things in terms of Bitcoin tend to fall, which makes it look like Bitcoin is a deflationary currency because the same amount of Bitcoin can buy more and more goods.
Mm-hmm.
You have to clarify kind of which version of inflation you're talking about, but technically speaking, Bitcoin is inflationary.
Right, and I knew you could clear that up for a lot of people. Now, what about belief? One of the things that Anthony Pompliano talks about a lot is this idea of belief and how important that is and integral to Bitcoin itself, especially given that social dynamics and social consensus is also relevant to the design. What are your thoughts on that? How much does belief, play out, or how much is belief a factor in Bitcoin's design?
What do you mean by belief?
Well, just in the sense of the human condition. If someone believes in something and they take that on board, or they, in this case, purchase this asset, by design, the more that people, engage with this, the more interest it attracts. Certainly, the more value it, clearly has. So, how important is spreading the word of Bitcoin, spreading the narrative, so that people, believe in this for its future, especially when it comes to the ideals of sound money?
Yeah, well, I guess belief is critical to the value of anything. I don't believe there's anything called objective value. Like value is always subjective. Value is always in the eye of the valuer. A nugget of gold to one person might be extremely valuable if they can sell it on an open market for things that they want. That same chunk of gold to a villager in a ancient society where gold wasn't used and they're starving and all they need is food, the gold doesn't matter to them whatsoever. So there's nothing objective about value. It's always subjective in terms of what someone can do with it. When it comes to Bitcoin, people shouldn't think in terms of like, we need to go around getting people to believe in Bitcoin. We should go around and teach people the utility of Bitcoin, why it is useful, what it does that's cool, and what it does that's interesting, and how it changes the world for the better. And when people understand why it's useful and valuable, then they'll believe in it. But that has to come from the understanding of its nature, not from some superficial belief without understanding it.
Well said.
You see this play out like in the bubbles, in the price bubbles. A lot of people will buy Bitcoin because the price is going up, which is like the worst reason to buy Bitcoin. And of all the good things about Bitcoin, if you're going to buy it because the price is going up, you really don't understand it. So that's not a good form of belief. If you buy it because you understand how valuable this technology is, then that's good. That comes from a place of understanding the utility. So that's, I think, that the way I'd frame it.
And I think, that is actually the crux for all those who are the true technologists and the true educators for all of these technologies, because at the end of the day, it's that long-term vision, not that short-term gain. So, full respect to you for having that value of technology first as opposed to price first, which is something of a marginalized view even in crypto perhaps, where a lot of people came in for price gains, for trying to
Yeah.
get rich
Well,
quick.
I mean, I can't pretend that I didn't even get drawn in by the price. Like when I first learned of Bitcoin, it was because there was an article about this weird asset that went up 500% in the last several months. And I clicked on the article because that was interesting to me. And I read it because that was an interesting phenomenon for an asset to rise so much. Um, but what happened was, as I learned what it was, I realized that there was something much deeper here. And the movement of the price over the last several months was really not the interesting part. It was the utility of the system.
Mm.
So when the bubbles happen, some people go through that process where they get instantly enticed by the price movements. That's just normal human interest. And then they start understanding what it's actually about. Those who don't understand what it's actually about, they'll flee as soon as the price starts going down.
Yes, and we're seeing that in some respects, but certainly there are more and more staying, trying to unpack and explore the value of this technology. Now, what about liquidity? Brad Garlinghouse, he talks about the imperative of that, and he makes a lot of claims about his own digital asset. But the reality is that liquidity does matter. How is the situation playing out for Bitcoin right now, especially given that you've seen the whole decade of growth?
Yeah, well, when I got involved in 2011, Bitcoin was like $5, and if you wanted to buy $10,000 of Bitcoin, you were going to move the price meaningfully.
Mm-hmm.
Today, you can buy $10 million of Bitcoin without moving the price at all. You could, if you're a little careful, you can probably buy $100 million of Bitcoin without moving the price too much.
Well, maybe you
So,
could, Eric. I couldn't.
no, I don't have $100 million in fiat sitting around.
Right.
That would be very foolish of me because it'll lose millions of dollars a year in value.
Right.
So yeah, I think liquidity is something that's earned over time. It's not something you can design for. It's something that's earned. And Bitcoin is far more liquid today than it was many years ago. 5 or 10 years from now, it'll be much more liquid than it is today. And that's just a natural process that happens in the market.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's interesting, and certainly, what about the future? What are your thoughts on continuing growth in terms of liquidity? Because the other issue is that there's also very relevant arguments for suggesting illegitimate liquidity, and also the ideas of fake volume as opposed to real volume. There's a lot of complexities there. So, how do we know that purported liquidity is, based on transparent and true reporting?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to judge real liquidity, talk to an OTC broker and ask for a certain amount of asset that you need and see what price you get. It really
Mm.
doesn't matter what's happening on all the exchanges. If you can call up a broker and get $100 million in Bitcoin over several days at a price that's roughly where it is now,
Mm-hmm.
that's highly liquid. Um, and that's the test: is can you actually do trades at that price? So yeah, what to what degree is there fake trading happening? There's always some of that. Maybe there's a lot of it, but you can buy a lot of Bitcoin and sell a lot of Bitcoin right now without moving the price very much.
Mm.
And every year that gets better.
Mm. And does it concern you though? You get the likes of, for example, the Block reporting on the idea of up to 90% of just more general volumes being fake across the board. Does it concern you at all about the fragility, if that's the case, of the more macro perspective of volume in crypto?
No, it doesn't, because the exchanges that are trustworthy and that people do a lot of the real trading on,
Mm-hmm.
you can actually do the trades, and the however much fake volume is existing out there doesn't really materially affect it. Now, if you're trying to do really high amounts of volume, then you need to care about these venues and how much liquidity is actually there or not. But these are problems for institutions at this level. No normal person needs to care about the liquidity of Bitcoin. It is far and away more liquidity on any given day than any normal person has to care about it at all. That was not the case in 2011, but it's definitely the case now.
Right, and it does seem that there are more and more exchanges emerging specifically to cater for institutional investment and institutional interest as well. So that could possibly be a boon for Bitcoin and beyond. But moving back to Bitcoin for a sec, I wanted to ask you about things like privacy and anonymity, because
Mhm.
neither of those things Bitcoin does well. And there was a misunderstanding, I think, at the beginning that somehow Bitcoin was the privacy coin. It was the way to circumvent
Yeah.
all authority. What are your thoughts on those 2 points?
Yeah, it's a great point. So certainly in the very early days, one of the USPs, one of the selling propositions of Bitcoin was it is this anonymous cryptocurrency. And people made that claim because you can open up a Bitcoin account without your name and send Bitcoin to some other account, and you don't even know who that other person is. They don't have some kind of registered account with their information at some bank. So people saw that, and relative to the banking system, that's incredibly private. That's it looks to a normal person anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
Now, within a couple years of that, people started realizing like this isn't really anonymity in a cryptographic sense. This is pseudonymity. This is relative privacy, but there's a big gap between relative privacy and anonymity.
Right.
So Bitcoin's always existed in this kind of, both things are true. It is in some ways extremely private, far more private than the banking system, and in other ways entirely trackable. It is the most trackable currency that's ever existed, and it's also one of the most private. And it kind of has, both of those are true statements depending on how it's used and how it's observed.
Mm.
I think it's good that Bitcoin isn't perfectly private, and this is something that my mind has changed on over the last few years. Years ago, I was sad that Bitcoin wasn't really anonymous, and I felt like that was a deficiency.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm realizing that if Bitcoin had been perfectly anonymous from the beginning, it may have really attracted the undue attention of the regulators much more ferociously.
I don't think may. I think definitely.
Would have, yes, would
Yeah.
have. It's kind of got this nice balance where it's the frog in the boiling water phenomenon.
Mm.
It is private enough to make governments worried, but it is also trackable enough to make governments tolerate it, which is a good place to be, actually. And for those people who need true anonymity in their cryptocurrency, there are several coins that are really good at that.
Such
And
as like Monero, do you mean things like that?
Monero and Zcash, Grin,
Mm-hmm.
these are kind of the main ones that people can use.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's part of the diversity of the ecosystem. So I think it's actually good that Bitcoin is not perfectly anonymous, but I wouldn't say that if there weren't alternatives that are.
And Erik, you raise a really interesting point, and also one that's very open-minded. I didn't expect that answer from you. And the reason is because when you have top-down authorities, looking at Bitcoin as a commodity, that happened because of these things that we're talking about right now, because there was that possibility for traceability, perhaps, the possibility for more transparency. Like you alluded to, if those things didn't happen and there wasn't that pseudonymous sort of nature to it, then perhaps they wouldn't have deemed it a commodity right from the outset.
Well, it would still be a commodity. The definition of Bitcoin as a commodity doesn't come from being anonymous or not,
Mm.
but they would have come down much harder on it. I mean, the governments of the world may have tried to just outright ban it by now if it was perfectly
Mm.
anonymous. I don't know.
Mm. Well, that's what I meant
But
to say.
yeah,
You're right. Classifying it is not fair, but more acknowledging it as something, opening up the
yeah,
dialogue for potential use of it. They've certainly
yeah. And
done that, which really surprised me.
for many of us that have been talking on Bitcoin, for years, we've been in various meetings with people in government and regulators and or people in the normal financial industry. And I have to say, it is very helpful to be able to say Bitcoin's not anonymous; it is perfectly traceable, and that is
Mm.
a factual statement. Um, that has helped this technology emerge less less antagonistically than it otherwise would. My goal is for cryptocurrency generally to take over the world and to destroy fiat currency. I think that's the inevitable outcome here. And so anything that allows the increased adoption of the stuff, in my opinion, is good because it makes that outcome more likely.
You certainly have those very altruistic ideals, and I really respect that a lot. And what about some of the core issues we've seen with Bitcoin? For example, those really very serious bugs, those inflationary bugs that could literally, have really destroyed Bitcoin without trying to, exaggerate what is true. What are your thoughts on those two bugs that happened? And are we at risk of more of these kinds of inflationary bugs in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ones you're talking about were many years ago, right?
There was one quite a few years ago, and then there was one that was detected more recently through a Bitcoin Cash, a technologist, I
Right.
think. So yeah, there was one
Yeah.
a bit more recent.
Yeah. So, you know, um, Bitcoin is now 10-ish years old and it is relatively trustworthy, but people need to realize that this is advanced software, and software can have bugs. Um, no one should be putting more money into Bitcoin than they can afford to lose in some sort of crazy calamity. There could still be some horrible 0-day exploit that just destroys Bitcoin. That is
Mm.
possible. Each day that goes by, it is less and less likely. And there are certainly, every hacker in the world has been trying to hack Bitcoin now for a decade. So that makes a very resilient and robust system. But no software is perfect, and I'm sure there are bugs in Bitcoin, small or large, that hopefully will get fixed if they come up. But yeah, it's a real risk. Bitcoin
Mm.
is not a perfect system that is without risk.
Right, and that's also why I would imagine you advocate for more of an open-minded view when it comes to the emergence of more and more assets that potentially are evidencing more utility or more experimentation towards even other types
Yeah.
of money. So diversifying investments is not an advice from either of us, but certainly makes more sense than having a very myopic view of
Yeah,
the space.
and this is where the relationship between Bitcoin and Ethereum, I think, is a very complementary one. Bitcoin is simpler, it is dumber in certain ways, and that makes it more stable and more secure. Ethereum can do more things right now than Bitcoin can. It is more advanced, but that also makes it more prone to bugs. It makes it riskier. And I think it's good that both of those systems exist and that there are other systems, beyond those two. I think that's
Mm.
part of the diversity here. And I think it's amazing that people can be experimenting with things in these Ethereum smart contracts without it jeopardizing, Bitcoin as the core standard of money. I think that's a very good aspect of this industry.
It's interesting because we also have some who suggest that there's equal or potentially better security in Ethereum as it moves forward with greater distribution of its nodes and greater, growth of its ecosystem. But again, that itself is subjective. It just hasn't seen these kinds of inflationary bugs we've seen with Bitcoin, but certainly it's had its own issues and its own bugs, certainly within its own framework. But with
Yeah.
regard to Bitcoin, let's go back there for a moment. One of the things you mentioned before is you weren't so concerned about wealth disparity, but certainly if we look at the addresses, for example, of Bitcoin, we know for sure that there's a small number of people who own a great deal of Bitcoin. And then there's
But
an
you
immense
don't know that
power.
those are people.
Well, we don't know there's a people. Let's just assume though that someone out there is connected to these addresses. I think that's fair to
But
say.
but no, it's actually not,
It's
because
not.
most of the big addresses that hold tons of Bitcoin are actually companies. They're actually
Okay.
exchanges. So they might represent 10 people or 10,000 or 10 million people. Coinbase has 20 million accounts, and it
Hmm.
has Bitcoin stored in X number of addresses. So you really can't look at one address and assume that that's one person. But
Okay.
regardless of that, I mean, there are certainly a lot of individual people that have huge amounts of wealth in crypto. So that's for sure.
Yeah, and you raise a good point. My apologies. Should have included entities in that. But let's open this up. So we have entities that potentially represent a large pool of people. Then we have the possibility, at least, of some individuals or whales as they're known. Does it concern you when you look at it, from a more objective standpoint, when we know that there's a few addresses that own a large majority of Bitcoin?
No. What concerns me is if people are stealing or defrauding from each other.
Mm.
If someone stole a bunch of Bitcoin, that concerns me. But if someone earned it, or if they bought it and have held on to it through all the volatility, you know, good for them. That doesn't bother me at all.
Mm. What about the potential though of collusion among some of those entities? This is where it gets really challenging because we don't have that empirical proof, obviously, but you've heard of the narrative and the stories too. Can Bitcoin be manipulated in terms of wash trading or collusion in terms of trying to somehow suppress price?
Sure. Everyone is equally able to manipulate Bitcoin based on the number of Bitcoins they have.
Mm.
So um, yeah, if you have any amount of money in Bitcoin, you can try to play the markets and try to trick other people into thinking something that isn't true. And everyone has access to that same system along those same rules. So there is an equality in the rules, not an equality in the outcome or in the result.
Right. And so as things can potentially play out, does it concern you? Because obviously Bitcoin's finite by number. And then obviously we have these real significant stakeholders in Bitcoin, regardless of whether they're entities or people. Does it concern you at all that this could be happening in terms of affecting price in such a way, because we're in such a small market now comparatively to mainstream markets, that some of the volatility isn't at all organic?
It doesn't concern me. I assume that's the case.
Mm,
In any given day in any market, there are people buying and selling some for, let's call it legitimate means, and people just trying to play the market to gamble, and people actually trying to manipulate the market. I think as long as people aren't being fraudulent, then there's nothing ethically wrong with what they're doing. And unless you're trying to day trade, you shouldn't really care what the price is doing day to day.
mm,
Um, People that want to manipulate the market cannot do so without risk. So if you have a huge position in Bitcoin and you want to try to sink the price, or you spike the price in some way, you can only do that by taking on risk, basically in proportion to the position that you're trying to take. And you may well lose it. And
mm.
people that, if someone has a ton of Bitcoin and wants to dump it on the market, I mean, basically what that means is a bunch of people were just able to buy up Bitcoin at below the quote unquote market rate. um, that maybe that person should be seen as a philanthropist. I don't know.
Mm.
But these are all issues of the short-term trading market. Normal people shouldn't be trading crypto as an active thing. They should own it if they believe in its long-term future. They should buy it or sell it when they need to. And if they want to day trade and think of that as gambling and as a fun form of entertainment, then go for it. But no, I mean, everyone should assume that manipulation in markets is happening. The difference in Bitcoin is that it's transparent. You can see the blockchain. You can see where Bitcoin is moving. You know exactly how many Bitcoin exist out there. Compare that to the normal financial market. No one has any idea how many dollars there are. No one has
Mm.
any idea where those dollars are. It is a black box. And so the ability to manipulate that undetected is far higher in the traditional markets than it is in Bitcoin.
Right. So in a sense, the code is its own police in this respect because of that traceability. So that's a really interesting point. Now, what about the modularity argument? Many people are saying that, when we look at this, the potential of Ethereum, it has a very modular design. It has, an insane amount of developers and applications building on top of it now in experimentation phases. So when we compare that to Bitcoin, which doesn't tend to have that same sort of scope, are you concerned at all that they're missing the boat when it comes to building upon in this very, well, as you mentioned before, this very crude protocol?
Um, I don't know. This is just one of those things that I think history will have a better sense of. I'm pretty much in favor of people experimenting in whatever direction they want to do it. Some people want to experiment on top of Bitcoin. Some people want to build whole new systems.
Mhm.
I think it's all great. I don't pretend to know what the right answer is there, but that's part of an open and somewhat chaotic market.
Got it. Now,
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead, of course.
I just got to run in 1 minute for another call. Just FYI.
Oh, I had so many more questions for Eric, but obviously I wanted to ask you about things like the cost of sending, for when we talk about payments, Eric. Obviously right now it's quite expensive, even if we compare that to stable coins, and you've been talking about them recently. So what are your thoughts on the emergence of alternative currencies, whether they be peg networks? I was speaking with PegNet last night, and what they're trying to do is build pegged stablecoin networks as well. So do you see that they all play a significant part in trying to help us transition into new money?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, this is the experimentation that no one really knows how it's going to play out.
Mm-hmm.
What's magical about this is that people have the ability to experiment and to try things. Most things that are new will fail. Most of these experiments will fail. Most of these new blockchains will fail, and that's all okay. And that's all part of the process of learning and building.
Mm.
And that never existed in the fiat banking world. There was not this ability to innovate and to try and to experiment and to fail. And now we have a free market and money, and that's happening in real time, and we're all able to witness it.
Mm.
So that's what people should be really excited about.
And just wanted to ask you one more question about, what is on the tips of many people's tongue, and that's China. Now we see the pro-blockchain narrative, we know that, but there's quite a strong anti-crypto sentiments in there today in terms of the assets themselves. But what are your thoughts on things like the allegations of mining monopolies or the interests of China potentially, whether that be from the government, whether that be from private entities, in trying to monopolize more of the mining power, the hash power of Bitcoin, especially when we see that it's well and over 50%, it's now 65% allegedly.
I think Bitcoin has a failsafe, which is that if any central party ever really controls Bitcoin, Bitcoin will fail and crash, and people will move into other blockchains,
Mm-hmm.
which actually makes it very silly to try to take over Bitcoin, because you could spend all that time and money trying to gain, more than half of the mining power or whatever on Bitcoin. And if you succeeded, all you'll do is destroy Bitcoin, and then the world will just move into different blockchains, maybe with a
Mm,
clone of Bitcoin that doesn't have that same mining algorithm or whatever.
mm.
So even there, that it's not the end of the road. It's just the market for cryptocurrency will adapt even to that.
Right. Well, you've made it clear you're not a Bitcoin maximalist, and you've even tweeted several times about how that can actually be toxic if it's just, a very one-sided, singular view. But one of the things I liked you mentioned recently is you said that Bitcoin's base block is pretty much set in cement forever. But once again, you talk about the value add of it being finite and of it being set as it's now going to be. But you also don't discount the future of these new technologies for their use cases. So you're still excited and bullish about the overall space as we move, and we still
Yeah.
see immense volatility today.
Yeah, I mean, more with each year, I get more excited about it. It just continues to gobble up the world of finance.
Mm,
So, yeah, zoom out and watch what's actually happening, and it's pretty incredible. So I think it's fascinating.
absolutely.
I
Well,
gotta hop off now.
for sure, Eric, thank you so much for your time. It's been
Yeah,
great to hear your side of it. You're very much well known and respected in the space. And thank you for leading out the narrative of education. Obviously it matters a great deal. And, we would obviously both encourage people to look more into the technological underpinnings of many of these assets so that you can become more informed. But this is Erik Voorhees. This is someone who represents a great deal of knowledge and understanding and experience in this space. And now he also has his own projects as well. It's Shapeshift. Erik, is there any other one that also needs plugging from you before you go?
no, shapeshift.com. Check it out. Trade crypto for free.
Absolutely. Well, they'll be in the description below. If you'd like to know more, don't forget to look into those. And also, on behalf of everyone who's wanting to know more about, your view and your vision, once again, thank you for your time today, Erik.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, mate.